Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is McKaylee. I work with Tattered Cover Bookstore, and I really just want to say thank you. I know that it's been a long summer with a lot that's going on, and I know that there's some Zoom exhaustion that's happening, but thank you all for joining us. We are really excited about this new book that came out last week. It is The Last Stargazers. I have my ARC copy here, and we're going to be talking to Emily Levesque and Philip Plate today. I just want to give you a couple of updates about Tattered Cover before we get started. So just so you know, 3 of our 4 stores are open, which is really exciting to hear. You can come in, please wear your mask as per government policy here in Colorado. We're open 7 days a week at our Aspen Grove location. Colfax is closed on Tuesdays, but open every other day. And Lodo's closed on Mondays, but open every other day. Every other day of the week, excuse me, not like every other. Yeah, you knew what I meant, 6 out of the 7 days. And so come in, stop in, visit us. You can still shop. We have masks and gloves and hand sanitizer available should you forget yours in the car or something like that. But you can come and wander and enjoy the bookstore. Our website, though, is still open 24/7. You can always order and have a curbside pickup, which we're having available, or have it shipped right to your door. And so we're happy to do that as well. Also, closed captioning on this video is available for those who might need it. On your video screen there, you just want to click the CC button, and that should work for those who may want it. Now I want to move on to talking about the wonderful guests that we have here today. Like I mentioned before, we are talking about The Last Stargazers by Emily Levesque, and she's going to be in conversation with Dr. Phil Plate. So Dr. Phil Plate is an astronomer, author, and science communicator. He's written 2 books, Bad Astronomy, Myths and Misconceptions from Astrology to the Moon Landing Hoax, and The Death from the Skies, all about the ways the universe can kill us. He writes the Bad Astronomy blog for SYFY, Sci-Fi Wire, and was the head science writer for season 1, Bill Nye Saves the World on Netflix, and was the writer and host for Crash Course Astronomy, which has 55+ million views on YouTube. And then our author today, Dr. Emily Levesque, is a professor in the University of Washington's Astronomy Department. Her research program is focused on improving our overall understanding of how massive stars evolve and die. She's the recipient of the 2020 Newton Lacey Pierce Prize and the 2014 Annie Jump Cannon Award from American Astronomical Society. She's also a 2019 Cottrell Scholar and a 2017 Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellow. From 2010 to 2015, she was the postdoctoral fellow at University of Colorado Boulder, and she's received her astronomy PhD at the University of Hawaii in 2010 and her SB in physics from MIT in 2006. And she is the author of the new book, The Last Stargazers, which came out August 4th, so you can get it online or in our stores now. I'm going to invite Phil and Emily to join me, and they're going to be in conversation, and then afterwards, I'm going to pop back in and we'll do a Q&A. All right, here we go. Let's see here. We can get our authors. There's Emily. Hello.
Hello. It's great to be here.
And then we're working. There's Phil. Hello.
Hello. Hello.
Hi.
How are you both today?
It's working.
It's working. Doing good.
You're working. You're doing great.
Lovely.
Yay. Well, I'm going to let you two get to it. And then talk all about The Last Stargazers, science, and all the fun, exciting things. I will pop back in. Like I said, audience members, if you have a question, you can write it in the chat box that is right next to your video screen. So think of those questions while Emily and Phil talk. Take it away, guys.
Thanks. Hi, Emily. Nice to see you.
You too.
I did not know you were at Boulder, or did I? I didn't know that, did I?
Yeah, I was there for 5 years as a postdoctoral fellow before I moved here to Seattle.
Well, that means you were here when I was here. I've been here for 12 years in the Boulder area.
Yeah, I think we might have collided for coffee at one point.
That's entirely possible. I can almost look out and see Boulder out my window, except for all the smoke from the wildfires. So
I've heard, yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's very exciting. Have you ever had an observing session wiped out because of a nearby wildfire?
I have not, but people have.
Yeah.
I talked to people that have either dealt with smoke or some folks that had to get evacuated from a mountain because wildfires get very close. Wildfires can be pretty dangerous for observatories. So yeah.
Yeah, I was at was it Stromlo in 2003
Yes, in Australia.
in Australia.
Hmm.
Yeah, I was there right after the fires, and
Yeah.
yeah, that was not good. Melted telescopes,
Yes, there's
actually.
an entire I remember talking to somebody about this. So a whole part of the Last Stargazers talks about sort of the natural phenomena that we find ourselves surprisingly close to at observatories, because we take these gorgeous high-tech instruments, but we build them in the middle of nowhere. And the title of the chapter is Hours Lost, Six Reason Volcano, which tells you about one of the things that astronomers sometimes deal with. But wildfires can be really serious, and we run into them in the American Southwest a lot. And two different observatories in Australia had this problem. Somebody told me that Mount Stromlo really ran into trouble because one of their telescopes had this huge, beautiful wood parquet floor, and the floor burned. And the telescope might have been
Yeah,
salvageable, but it essentially got cooked from underneath by the wooden floor, which is just
right.
incredible.
You
Yeah.
know what? Keep talking. It reminds me, I should have grabbed this, but I'm going to grab something. Hang on. Go ahead. Keep
Go ahead
going.
and grab it. A thing that I loved about the Australian wildfire story, like a sad silver lining that came out of it, is that in the aftermath, people actually salvaged some of the parts of the telescope. And there was an art sculpture that was built sort of commemorating stargazing and commemorating telescopes and astronomy with sort of what they were able to salvage from the observatory. So it was incredibly sad to lose the research capability, but there's still amazing astronomy being done in Australia, and hopefully everything will stay safe there for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, it's a great site out there, and it's quite dark, and there aren't that many big observatories in the Southern Hemisphere.
Right.
I don't know if you can see this. This is a piece of glass
Mm-hmm.
from, I want to say it was a 48 inch. I read it was 50, but it was a telescope that
Is it a 48 inch
was
now?
doing,
Because you have
not
that?
anymore.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
What
maybe.
happened?
That's a good point. It did the Macho survey in the Large Magellanic Cloud. It was looking for gravitational lenses, an astronomical phenomenon, mapping those to look for objects that maybe you can't see normally, like planets drifting between stars and galaxies. And this telescope, it got so hot that the mirror shattered in place. So if you ever seen, you hit a window with a hammer and it just
Mhm.
shatters, it crazes is the expression, right? That's what this thing did. And I was looking at it and I just reached in and pulled out a piece, and the tour guy said, yeah, you can keep that if you want. I mean, what the hell are we going to do with it? So
Yeah.
yeah, this is a piece of mirror from that.
That that's
Terrifying.
the, that's the sort of story that I mean, not loved getting, because you don't love hearing about beautiful research facilities getting destroyed, but those are the sorts of stories that kind of got at why I wrote The Last Stargazers, because it's a fairly
And that's what I
straightforward
was going to
story.
say. Go ahead.
Well, so it's funny that in that story, there's little bits of science that you and I take for granted because we spend a lot of time with this sort of thing, but that are kind of surprising and new to people that wonder like what we do all day or what we do all night. That piece of glass that you held up was huge and thick. And people sometimes think of telescopes and they think of like the little things that pirates hold to their eyes with little lenses. And today, telescopes use mirrors, and they use mirrors that are enormous and heavy. You were describing the telescope as a 48 inch. And we toss around that term all the time. And then people will hear, okay, a 200-inch telescope, is that how tall it is? Is that how far it can see? That doesn't seem very far.
Yeah.
And it ties back to the most important part of a telescope, which is its big primary mirror that collects light. And the size of those mirrors becomes so important that astronomers are terrible at naming things, but we all use the size of the mirror as like a shorthand for the telescope. So it's the 48 inch or the 200 inch or the 3.5 meter a lot of the time, because that everything literally revolves around that mirror, and marks that mirror is so important. So you tell a story about some wacky thing that happened at work, but in the story are these bits of, how does our job work? What do we need? And what are we trying to do? So that was the idea behind the book, was kind of collecting these stories and using them to teach people. Yes, hang on, wait, I got mine too. But it's collecting these stories and using them to teach people about what our jobs are like, about the science behind what we do, but doing it with really putting a human face on things. Professional astronomers are pretty rare. There's 7.5 billion people on the planet, and about 50,000 of us are astronomers. So most people don't
That
talk
many,
to
really?
one. Huh? I remember trying to work
that
out
many?
the numbers. Yes, around 50,000 worldwide. If we go to all the continents.
That's too many. There are too many astronomers.
Right, right. That's too many people to be studying the entire rest of the universe, right? And yeah, people don't generally get the chance to talk to one of us or ask us what we do. And I would get asked these great questions like, oh, do you go to the Hubble Space Telescope? Which, like, if only. But do you just stay up all night? Do you have a telescope in your backyard here in Seattle, which would be a little disappointing. So it seemed like a way to remind people who the people are doing this research and tell the stories that are kind of familiar to us. Like, I'm betting not everybody's broken a 48-inch wide mirror, but everybody's had that thing that they've wrecked at work, or that really rough day, or like a tough commute, which for someone else might be snowy Colorado roads, and for us might be the ridiculous roads up to telescopes. But there's familiar threads in there that can kind of connect people on the human side, and then they get this peek into the wacky science that we do. So that was how the book kind of came about, is through stories like the one you just told.
Did you just keep hearing them? And because I'm looking back, you're a little bit younger than I am, and I'm looking back to when I was in grad school and thinking about the stories that we heard, the things that were unfolding while I was there, and we'll get to that because you've written about some of those stories, and it's funny to see them written like as a historical thing that happened, and like, no, I was there when that happened. So, wow, okay. But did this idea just kind of come to you? Did it sort of congeal as more and more stories started weighing on you and thinking somebody's got to write all these down? How did that work?
So part of it was that somebody should write all of these down, because one of the kind of narrative backbones of the book is how astronomy is changing, and how we went from decades ago capturing photos on these thin little glass photographic plates and like literally sitting inside telescopes and riding telescopes all night, to what we do now, where we operate telescopes from another room or another state, or a robot just runs the telescopes. And a lot of the human stories of astronomy kind of represent an era that we're not getting back, or that may be disappearing, and you just want to write them down because they're incredible. I also remembered my very first observing run at Kitt Peak Observatory in Arizona, sitting down at dinner with people. And my advisor, Phil Massey, said, hey, this is Emily's first observing night. And all the other astronomers went, oh, cool. We need to tell you this story. Or you need to look out for scorpions. Somebody got stung by one once. Or one time a guy locked himself in the bathroom and lost 15 minutes of telescope time before he could get himself out, which is true. It's in the person's research paper. He says, sadly, 15 minutes of time were lost. But they started telling me these stories. And looking back on it, it was their way of kind of welcoming me into the crew. And they were little glimpses of why the work we did was so unusual. Like, losing 15 minutes of telescope time sounds trivial, but one night of time is super precious. And like 15 minutes could be that extra star that you didn't get the chance to point at. And scorpions sound like awful anywhere, but you don't necessarily think, oh, I'm at this world-class research facility. And you imagine like a lab with people in lab coats in this nice clean room, and there'll be scorpions or tarantulas coming in. So that was how they welcomed me. And those are the stories we all tell each other. So they seemed like a great way to kind of direct stories that we would tell to the public. I also always have, during public talks, people resonating with these stories and kind of the wacky stuff that winds up happening to us.
You can't talk to an astronomer with any of these stories without them adding their own. I mean, you mentioned a scorpion. I've had an encounter with a copperhead snake once, very, very close to my face. That was my own fault. I was being an idiot, but still, as you mentioned, these observatories, they're not in the middle of cities. They're not in the suburbs. They're out in the wilds where there are no lights, and you don't know what you're going to get. And and also, you mentioned photographic plates. Check this out.
Oh, yes.
Right? This is a box of, this was 5x7 photographic plates. For those of you who don't know about film, before digital cameras, we used to have plastic. You'd spray a chemical on it that's sensitive to light, and you'd have to take your picture and develop it. And you can do that on photographic plates. And I've got two of the ones I've taken at Fan Mountain in Virginia.
Look at how thin and delicate they are. Yeah.
This is a comet. Let's see if I can get there, something like that. Yeah. This is a negative, right? So it's black on white. The bright things are black. So that's a Comet Bradfield. I took this in 1987. is that possible? This would have been my first year at UVA. And I
Yep.
wrote down the exposure time, 18 minutes. I had to load this plate. Look at how thin that is. That is a piece of glass, right? And it's got the emulsion, the chemical on one side. And I had to pull this out of the box in the darkroom, load it up into a piece of machinery, stick it on the back end of the telescope and take the pictures, then develop it myself. And it was a pain in the butt.
Now here's the question.
When
Did
digital
you
cameras
have to
came
lick
along,
it?
I was like, yes, actually, if you,
There you go.
let's see if I can do this. There's a chemical sprayed on one side of the glass and not the other. And a lot of the times, the other side of the glass is sprayed with a non-reflective chemical. And that way you don't get light bouncing back and forth and screwing up your plate. So the way I would do it.
Yep. You see which
I can
side.
hardly hear the difference because I have fillings there. But you could hear it when you tap it with your teeth, it would go ding, ding, ding. And the emulsion side would go dunk, dunk, dunk because you're hitting something a little bit sticky. Or you can put your tongue to it and you can taste it.
So many people that I talked to had different stories of how they would work with these plates because they're so fiddly, they're so delicate. And you would bake them or freeze them or coat them with a chemical. People would like put lemon juice on them or ammonia, and then you'd have to load them into a camera and you do it all in the dark. So if you pointed the wrong side out, the wrong side would be facing the light and then the chemical wouldn't react to light and darken. So people talked about tapping it to their lip, licking it. One guy swore he could taste the difference between different treatments. He was like, oh, this plate detects blue light and this plate detects red light because of the taste. Apparently the smart people learned to try and lick the non-sticky side. But it sounds really ridiculous. Like we're going to lick this thing, stick it in a camera and then like photograph galaxies. But it's the tools that we had.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you ever taken a plate?
Never taken a plate. My first observing ground was in 2004. People are very amazed, though, at how late plates happened, that I think people imagine it as this sort of like ancient historical thing, and they picture like black and white photos. It's like, no, these were in use well into the 1980s as we kind of phased from photographic plates to CCDs, which are basically the equivalent of the digital camera that you all have in your phones. So that was wonderful because the data then came out digitally and you got it in a file. And if you wanted to mess with the file, you could just copy and paste it. There wasn't like one precious plate, but it was a slow transition yeah. Oh, and the number of people I talked to that were like, I shattered a plate once. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I broke several of them. It just happens. You know, that's why you get a box of them. If you can get 4 or 5 good plates out of a box, you're probably doing pretty well.
Yeah.
And I love how you said,
yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I mentioned copy and pasting the files, but I have been observing long enough to remember sort of the large suite of storage devices that we would use to keep plates on. Because now they live on a hard drive, but I remember my whole thesis, I burned all the data to CDs. And my first projects, we had these like little exabyte tapes that nobody on this live stream has encountered, I would guess. And I know that there were versions of plates before that, but it was just whatever we could do to store the data. Yeah.
Yeah, when I worked with Hubble, we used exabyte tapes, and we had a rack that we were constantly backing up everybody's computers. But when we had our first CCD, and I got my master's with it in 1990, I was observing in '89. All of that was saved on a 9-track reel-to-reel tape, right? One of those white tapes. She's spinning in the background of those old movies and stuff. Yeah, that's what I had to use. And they were a nightmare. And it's like, I don't think this is better than plates. I mean, the CCD is way more sensitive. So I could take an hour or 2 exposure on a plate and do that same exposure in 5 minutes with a digital camera because they're so much more sensitive.
Yes.
And then, of course, your data is digital. So once I had my data off the reel to reel, oh my God. You know, I would manipulate the data and everything and realize I'd screwed everything up, and I could go back to the original data and start again. You can't do that with a plate.
You can't do that with a plate.
Start messing with a plate. Yeah, you've messed with it. It's done.
The technology we use to always crack some people up, because I think people picture astronomy sometimes and they picture like the deck of the Enterprise and they picture something wonderfully high tech and just super cutting edge. And a lot of the stuff that we use is incredible. We're using really amazing CCD cameras that are getting built now, but there's also a little bit of the, if the old things work and don't mess with it. And my favorite story about that comes from the Very Large Array, which is this big array of radio telescopes in New Mexico. And people watching probably know it from the movie Contact. It's this beautiful, wild, very photogenic array of giant white radio antennae. And they filmed on site, and they filmed Jodie Foster searching for and then hearing from aliens. And there's this famous shot where she's like listening through headphones, which we really don't do in radio astronomy, and hearing the signal and driving through all these telescopes and running in the building door. And that's the real building at the Very Large Array. They film her running in the door, running up the stairs, running down the hallway. And then as she swings open the doors into the control room, you can't see it, but there's a camera cut. And they refused to film in the actual VLA control room. They were like, this looks so old. You've got like ancient tape running in the background and these really like dead old computers. They're like, we're going to build a set that looks a little cooler than this. So the VLA was in the movie right up until the place where the astronomers actually spend all our time.
Well, I heard, and I can segue this into something about the book that I was thinking about as I was reading it. I heard that Robert Zemeckis, who directed Contact, was so detail oriented though, that he actually took samples of the carpet from the control room so that they could find it. And when they built their set, use that. Now, I have no idea if this is true, although, reading stories about Zemeckis, it's like, well, maybe. I mean, you read about Kubrick and these other directors that are just maniacal about that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But I was thinking, thinking about the stories and reading about it. And by the way, everybody who's listening, this book is wonderful. I mean, I'm biased because I'm an astronomer and I've talked to Emily about some of this stuff before, and I'm familiar with a lot of the stories in it because, I've read about them or heard about them before. So absolutely you should order this book and read it because it's great. Tell your friends, buy 10 copies. Why not? Hey,
yeah. From Tattered Cover.
But from Tattered Cover. And I love Tattered Cover. I've been there a couple of times. I've had friends give talks there, and that's a great bookstore. And I should be careful and say thank you for allowing us to do this under their auspices. There's a story I want to bring up specifically because it is probably the weirdest story in there, at least from my point of view, for a lot of reasons. But I have a personal involvement with this, and that is the Green Bank telescope collapsing.
Yes.
I'm going to let you tell that story.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to let you tell the story. Do you think you can here?
Absolutely. Yes. So
go ahead.
So I always describe this story in one phrase as the telescope that fell down. And it does not do justice to how dramatic this was. So Green Bank Observatory is out in West Virginia, which is this very interesting part of it's in this very interesting corner of West Virginia, which is designated the United States National Radio Quiet Zone. And it is specifically an area where radio interference is kept to a minimum. And this means that residents don't have Wi-Fi, very near the telescope, they will only drive diesel cars because the sparks from spark plugs will create radio interference. Microwaves, if people have them in their homes, they have to be kept in special cages and they're not allowed too close to the telescope. And this is all because the telescopes at Green Bank are radio telescopes, and they detect these wavelengths that those devices would create all sorts of noise in. If you turned on one of these telescopes with radio devices around, it would just get all this junk and we'd have trouble getting real data. So this observatory had a 300-foot radio telescope, and that's immense. We can build radio telescopes much, much bigger than we build optical telescopes. And it was this giant white towering antenna that you could see it from the highway as you were driving to the observatory. It would come looming over a hill like this massive building. And this telescope one evening was in the middle of an observation. There was an operator working in the control room, kind of running the telescope and making sure everything went well. And to hear him tell the story, he just suddenly heard this awful crashing noise, and he heard something falling in the hallway. I think he half remembered seeing something punch through the ceiling, and he knew something had gone horribly wrong, drove to a different telescope on site, picked up some colleagues, drove back. And as they were sort of driving up the road, their headlights were illuminating the site where the telescope was supposed to be. And instead of this nice, neat white dish, they just saw this twisted pile of metal. And the telescope had honest to God, just fallen down. There was a whole investigation. There was a whole inquiry as to what had happened. And like one piece of the telescope that was a support structure was just a tiny bit too small to support the weight. I think they ultimately didn't hold anyone responsible. Like they couldn't have seen this coming ahead of time. They didn't think it was a threat to other radio telescopes with the same design. It was just a freak accident. But I hope you can see this in the book since I'm not set up to share a screen, but this is what the telescope normally looked like. This is what it looked like after it fell down. So it was an absolutely catastrophic destruction of the telescope. Amazingly, the telescope kept taking data even up until it almost started falling down. So it like helped solve its own murder because they were able to look at the data and say, well, what exactly started going wrong? But it's far and away the most epic how a telescope got destroyed story that people had told me. Because I mean, look at the wreckage of that thing.
Right. Yeah, the way I describe it to people is it's like an umbrella in the wind and it flaps the other way. So like the dish went from, being this way to being this way. Yeah. And it just settled down. And I have many stories about that. I've been to Green Bank a few times, and it's weird because the diesel engines, those cars are really old clunkers. I think a lot of them are old taxi cabs from like the 50s. And so they don't have spark plugs, right? So they don't generate radio waves that will interfere, like you said. So I want to add to this story because this is bizarre. I was at University of Virginia for grad school from 1987 to 1994. The telescope collapsed in 88, 89? 88.
Yep.
It was 88 in the fall semester when I was taking radio astronomy with Jay Lockman, who was the director, as I recall at the time, of the Green Bank Observatory. And he was affiliated with the National Radio Astronomy Observatory, which has their campus on the UVA campus, where I was taking. So Jay was teaching the radio class, and he comes in one day and he says, yeah, the telescope collapsed. I'm like, wait, what? And we were supposed to head out there the next week. And we weren't going to use that telescope. There's another telescope there that we used as a radio astronomy class. It was just like an hour and a half drive out to West Virginia from there. So we went there, used the other telescope. By the way, that 140-foot radio dish sits on a single 7-foot ball bearing, the single largest ball bearing I've ever seen. It was really something. It's like, oh, it's a ball bearing. It's like, yeah, it's 7 feet across. It's huge. So cool. And we went to see the 300-foot that had collapsed. They had not really been able to do anything with it yet. And so they gave us hard hats and we're walking around. And while we were there was just debris on the ground, like this plate. This is the sort of thing that broke on that telescope and caused the whole collapse, much larger. And I've got like twisted, look at that twist in there. I don't know if you can see that. And just bolt sheared off. Part of the antenna itself just folded over, just crushed. Yeah.
I was interviewing someone about this, and she stopped, got up, and then handed me a piece of the dish. And I remember thinking, if you're holding a piece of the telescope, something's gone terribly wrong. Yep, there we go.
Oh God, there's dirt coming out of this from Green Bank. I've had this in a box for years. So yeah, I mean, it was amazing. And then the next time we were in class, a week later, Jay was talking to us and saying, yeah, they're not allowing anybody over there anymore because apparently as that metal was settling, it put so much stress on things that pieces of metal, like bolts, were shooting off like bullets. Yeah. They're like, yeah, we're not going to let anybody. So, we could have been killed walking around. Very low chance, but yikes.
The early people who came across this accident, like the folks that were getting driven back in the truck that saw it illuminated by headlights, one of them was looking in the back seat of the truck and he said there was a bolt in the back seat painted like the 300-foot. And the back window of the truck had been taken out. So part of the telescope had actually fallen into this guy's car and damaged part of it. And then you hear about the scientists showing up, and for a bunch of, very analytical folk, it was this very sort of familiar grieving process of they would hear the telescope fell down and they'd go, no, telescopes don't fall down. Like whatever happened, it's something else. And then they would show up, see the destruction. And there's this wonderful account of it where people are giving all these descriptions of what they thought it looked like. And they're saying it looked like melted caramel instead of steel. I didn't know a telescope could do that. And to hear it told that first morning, telescope employers are just sort of showing up and standing there like, what? Like just unable to believe what they're seeing, because you never expect a telescope to do something like this. And I've heard a number of telescopes getting dinged up in some way stories, but this was one of the ones where you just see an utter obliteration of a beautiful
Yeah,
instrument.
I've never seen anything like it.
Fortunately, there was money eventually brought in to rebuild a new, now it's what, the 100-meter telescope at Green Bank that is still running today and is still working great. Although I think my husband was the one that pointed out to me, you look at the picture of the 300-foot and it's got this nice little structure, and then before it collapsed, and then you look at the 100-meter and it's got like a pedestal. Like, it is very, very securely supported. That telescope is not falling down. Yeah.
Yeah, the scale of it is unbelievable. It's like, it's the size of a football field.
Yeah.
And imagine taking a football field and lifting it up in the air and pointing it
and
at
turning
things.
it.
That's
Yeah.
what.
Mhm.
Yeah. There's so many good stories in here, but I think I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the very pissed off grad student. You know where this is going, and the gun.
Mm.
And I believe it's the McDonald Observatory.
Yes. So
in Texas.
I said the last story was the telescope that fell down, and this one is the telescope that got shot. And I loved this story because of the legend that it's become in astronomy. I interviewed over 100 astronomers for this book to compile all of their stories and then tie it together with this tale of how astronomy is changing and my own kind of entry into astronomy. But I wanted to get as many stories as I could. And I asked everybody, what third hand, 10th hand, totally unreliable, you can't vouch for it story do you just love? Because I wanted to get at the wacky stories and then try to hunt them down. And the most common answer by far was, do you have the one about the telescope that got shot? And sorting through the myth of that story was one of the wild parts of the book. So one of the most common myths is that it was a disgruntled grad student wielding the gun, which it was not. My favorite version of this was there was some spurned lover and some torrid love affair that went wrong, which is also not true.
Yeah, something about the thesis advisor and the wife.
Oh, yeah, an angry thesis advisor.
Yeah,
none of that was the case, but it had all gotten built into the story. And what had actually happened, it's unfortunate because the actual shooter was an employee of the observatory who, to hear it told that night, he had been drinking, he was suffering from a mental breakdown, he was disturbed, and he became hell-bent on trying to destroy the brand new telescope on the mountain, which was, we were talking about sizes, the 107-inch telescope. And he stormed in there, he was wielding a gun, he threatened the operator, and then decided he was going to use the gun to try and destroy the mirror. So he fired 7 shots into that 107-inch primary mirror. But you all saw the size of the piece of glass that Phil held up early on. It was like this thick. So imagine a piece of basically Pyrex that's about this thick. And he was shooting a 9mm, and these bullets just kind of went and stuck in the mirror like darts on a dartboard. And it didn't destroy the telescope. It didn't even shatter the telescope. He was underwhelmed. He started trying to go at it with a hammer. But at this point, he was able to be subdued and the authorities were called. And the telescope kind of went down in history from there as the telescope that got shot. And the funny part is that the word got out and people thought mistakenly that the telescope had been utterly destroyed. So the observatory director had to put out this announcement saying, nope, the harm from the bullets was extraordinarily small. That's where I got the title for the 5th chapter of the book. And all we did was sort of dig out the bullets, paint over the holes, and we were able to start observing it. That the 107-inch basically became the 106-inch because we lost a little of the volume of light, of like the space that we could use to collect light. So you can still see the bullet holes in the telescope when they take it out to kind of repolish it, but it's by far the most sort of legendary story in the field of, my God, that telescope that got shot in Texas. So,
yeah, we're running out of time, unfortunately, but I maybe somebody will ask something like this about how you confirm some of these stories, because I'd heard, it was like you said, a spurned lover, a lot of these other things. With the radio telescope collapse, I heard that he didn't hear anything. He went back to the operating room, and for some reason there was just no data coming in, and then he walked outside and saw it. So, you hear all these stories, and confirming them, that must have been a nightmare.
I kind of love how stories like this get a life of their own. And it was a project to dig up primary sources and dig up at least the most reliable versions that I could get. And sometimes you kind of steer into, nobody knows quite what happened, but what we do know is this. But Scientists are just as susceptible to it as anybody else, and it made it a fun aspect of digging up and then retelling the stories.
We love our stories. Yeah.
We do.
Okay, so McKaylee is back to tell us that it's time for Q&A.
Yes. So I also just say thank you for sharing the stories, Emily, in the form of your book, but then also hearing them from the two of you, and Phil with your show and tell. It's been really great. Being an English and theater major, I actually had the chance to work at Yerkes Observatory up in Wisconsin. Nice. And so, because I had an internship at NASA after college, long story, but hearing all these stories about the different observatories was bringing me and having my memories back to when I met my physicist boyfriend, and and how magical those places are. And you really capture that in the book, but it's so cool to hear the two of you just bouncing off of one another. So thank you so much for that. It was really fun to listen to. It was really hard to stop you. But yeah, so
we could go on for a while. We didn't even get to Hubble. So
I know. Oh, good Lord. Well, hopefully someone will ask about it. We do have Q&A. You all have been amazingly active in the chat so far. So feel free, if you have any questions for Emily, for Phil, both, please feel free to ask them in the chat. We've got a little bit of time for Q&A. I think there's a lot of astronomers on there sharing stories. There's a lot of people talking about, one comment was like, oh, and my roommate in college who didn't think astronomy was dangerous. And yet here you are talking about telescopes getting shot.
This is what will happen when you get a group of astronomers together in a room. And like I said, this was partly where the idea came from. If you had 5 of us on here, we would just never shut up. But it is surprising to people that astronomy is adventurous. I think people have this mental picture of somebody in a lab coat for some reason, just kind of peering through a telescope and then taking notes. And it can be scarily dangerous sometimes, but even little things like a telescope getting dinged up or being near scorpions and things like that are really surprising people. I did not expect when I went into this as a field that there was going to be this Indiana Jones-esque component. We have not even talked about the last observing run that I went on, which was riding on an experimental aircraft with the telescope that observed out of the open back door. So none of this was on my list of things I thought would happen to me when I decided I wanted to be an astronomer.
And so when and how did that decision come to you?
I was tiny. I was a really little kid. It's a story I tell at the start of the book. And I love that we've just had Comet Neowise go by because it's about another naked eye comet. I got to observe Halley's Comet because my big brother was doing a school project on it, and apparently tiny me was fascinated. And after that, I was just like, well, I'm going to be a ballerina or an astronomer when I grow up, or I'm going to be a firefighter or an astronomer, or a marine biologist or an astronomer. An astronomer just stuck. And then I got to college, majored in physics, had an unbelievable time trying to keep up with the physics curriculum at MIT, but got the chance to do some early astronomy research and go on my first observing run, and I just fell in love with it as a result.
How about for you, Phil?
Oh, I have the same story. I was born a while before Comet Halley. But yeah, I mean, it was looking through a telescope when I was a little kid and seeing Saturn and saying, yeah, that's pretty much it. But, as you get older, it's like, well, I've also been, a computer programmer, a writer, an education director, an author, a speaker. And I was just thinking about that with Emily. It's like, yeah, you wanted to be an astronomer, and now look, right? You're also a speaker. You gave a great TED Talk and an author. So, that's what happens. You spread out.
It's funny because when I interviewed people, I never asked anybody why they became an astronomer because I wasn't writing origin stories. I was writing, weirdest thing that happened at a telescope, or what do you think would surprise people about the way we do our jobs? And so many people told me their origin stories anyway, because their origin stories are observing stories, and our imagination gets captured by the sky in a really dark place, or our first view of Saturn. So many people mention Saturn because it is just so cool looking through a telescope, or they saw a meteor shower, or got to look at the moon with binoculars. And it really connects back to the very romantic, in some ways, reasons that people go into the field.
That's awesome. That's so great to hear. There's a question about people that maybe you had to observe in your interview versus observing the sky, and if you found any similarities between the two.
Oh, in terms of observing the people and getting data from what I saw, there were a little so I'm not a trained journalist and I'm not a trained interviewer. And it was very fun to learn this as I went. And one thing that I remember observing was talking to people about working with photographic plates, which is what we were describing earlier. And they would get these little thin glass plates, and you would just order them in batches from Kodak. So they would come in these big boxes, but the camera that they fit into might be really tiny. And people would have to use these really sharp, like diamond roller cutters to cut the plates. Phil's nodding. And you have to do all this in the dark because the plates will respond to light. So you've got the super sharp thing and you're slicing up a plate in the dark. I heard one or two stories about like there being a crack and someone yelling, and then you turn on the lights and they're like bleeding. But people could mime decades after having done this. They could mime cutting the plates and exactly how they would move the roller and exactly how they did it. And what I noticed is everyone would close their eyes when they did it because it was such a sense memory. To do it right, you couldn't see, which it was just something amazing to observe. I didn't film any of my interviews. I audio recorded all of them, but I remember watching and just going, everyone's shutting their eyes when they remember this in the dark task of their research.
That's a really great observation. There's so many, you mentioned the fact that there's 50,000 astronomers worldwide. And I'm curious, and I think this is a great question for both of you, but what is the best advice that you have for students that want to become a part of that group of professional astronomers?
I'll jump in first because I remember asking, I'd never met an astronomer growing up. We didn't have astronomers doing research in my town. I got to talk to one astronomer when I was about 8 because we went to a nearby college's like science night. And I asked him, I'm going to be an astronomer. What should I do? And he said, take all the math you can. And I didn't hate math at the time. I wasn't like a super math gung-ho kid, but I was like, all right, I'll take math, and started taking as much math as I could and doing like accelerated math classes. I think today it's take all the math you can and computer science too, because math and computer science are so like the language and the tools of what we do in astronomy. And we're starting to get such huge heaps of data in astronomy that being able to program something to handle it, or being able to deal with the statistics of studying 1 million stars instead of 1 star is just huge. So if there's a kid going like, all right, what's my Olympic training program to become an astronomer? Math and computer science are a part of it. It's a tiny field. It can be it's a competitive field for sure. Like I feel very lucky that I get to do this research every day, but it came back to the math and computer science kind of nuts and bolts that let me do the research I wanted to do. Phil, I don't know if your addition to that.
Well, it's funny that when I was learning astronomy, it was a long time ago, now it doesn't feel like it, but it was, 30 years ago, and things have changed a lot. And when I got out of school and started doing communication like this, I would tell people the same thing, learn programming languages and that sort of thing. And I don't know if that's just something that kids take in school now, probably not the same sort of thing that astronomers use, Python and IRAF and IDL, all these really bizarre things. But I would say that, but also, writing classes. You're going to be writing a lot more than you think, right? Mm-hmm. You're writing papers to get published. You're writing your degrees, which is different, writing your thesis sometimes than writing a paper. And you know what you're going to be doing a lot? You're going to be writing grant applications a lot. And I have read many grant applications where I thought, this person really needs to learn how to, subject predicate matching and all that kind of thing, which is one of my downfalls. But also, it helps a lot to be able to do that. And also, you don't know where this career is going to lead. A lot of astronomers wind up doing different things that their training has given them insight into. Like what I do is I write about astronomy every day, and I can read a journal paper. I can say, how is somebody going to, what's the important thing here? What do they not need to know to understand this? So it really helps just to take a broad range of classes, but specifically, like Emily said, math and computer science, that's super important.
I want to run with the writing a little bit too, because I'm so glad you mentioned that, because it really helps us to be good communicators and good storytellers in our jobs. Like a point that I've made to students before is if Einstein had come up with his theory of general relativity, but was terrible at explaining it, nobody would have cared. We wouldn't have gotten it. We would have needed to get it from someone else. And being able to explain what you're doing and then explain why it's important is how you get grant money. It's also how you get time on a telescope, because telescope time is a resource just like funding for us. So a committee will read proposals and say, we have 300 nights on a telescope to give away, and then we spend the other 65 doing maintenance or engineering. And one person needs 2 nights to study how stars die. Does that sound like a good use of 2 nights, or should it go to somebody looking for life on other planets? Like, and you have to be able to make your case to a committee of your peers. Also, the best scientific discoveries sometimes read like mystery novels almost. It's, we found this weird thing and we didn't know what it was, and we dug into the mystery and found this new evidence. Like, I had somebody say, wow, it reads like a crime novel where you're doing a like whodunit mystery but explaining what killed a star. And being able to tell that story to people is good for your peers and for helping people understand what you did. And it helps get folks who, you know, help support the NSF or NASA excited about what we're doing. So the communicating is so important.
And it might one day help you write a book. Which is very true too. And it's something that Phil has done as well. I thoroughly recommend this. I feel very blessed to have a physicist boyfriend who I listen to. There's his books.
Yes.
You can also order at tatteredcover.com. And you definitely should. I was saying that I feel so blessed to have a physicist boyfriend who I listen to when he talks, so I can understand some of the things like Python that you guys are talking about. But this book, you really get to the heart of it, and it really humanizes something that some people like me, was so happy she didn't have to take science class in college because she did all of them in English or in high school, that like it doesn't make it scary, and it makes it fun, and like you said, read really well. And I highly recommend this book to anyone. I know that Phil does as well. So Emily, thank you for writing down these stories. Thank you for being a caretaker of them. And I want to just give each of you an opportunity to, you know, before we close out here, just tell everyone where they can find you online or any other last minute things that you want to add to it. Phil, do you want to go first? You already mentioned your books.
Sure. Emily should clean up here anyway at the end. I am on Twitter as Bad Astronomer. The best place to find everything I do is about.me/PhilPlate, because I have links to everything there. And I do write the Bad Astronomy blog on sci-fi-wire.com. Type my name into Google, you'll find where I'm blathering on about something or another.
And I just updated my name, which you should see along the bottom of the screen. I'm on Twitter at Empsk. And on there, you can follow me to hear about the research that I do and the research that my amazing students do, all about sort of the physics of how stars work. I also talk about the Last Stargazers with the hashtag the Last Stargazers. And if you go to thelaststargazers.com, you can read more about the book. You can read, I had a sort of series of blog entries and updates telling some of the stories that are in the book. You can find it on Instagram at the Last Stargazers, and on the website, you can find places to order the book. I think everybody should be ordering it from Tattered Cover. And you can do that at Tattered Cover's website, and IndieBound also lets people order from local bookstores, and we have a link to it on the page. So yeah, that's where you can find me online.
Yeah, well, thank you for supporting local independent bookstores. It's because of you authors that we get to continue doing these virtual events here online during uncertain times. And so we're just very grateful for the stories that you continue to give us and for your time. Thank you both so much. If you two will just hang out for a second before I close out and cut the feed. My name's McKaylee. I work at Tattered Cover Bookstore, and you guys can order Emily's book, The Last Stargazers, as well as Phil's books, at tatteredcover.com. And we look forward to seeing you guys. We have more events coming up August. We have one more on August 21st, which is a Friday. And so you guys should check out our website and continue reading, happy reading, and stay safe. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
And we're out.